You're live.
Thank you, Ken. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee on Appropriations. We have 3 agencies to hear the budgets of today. We'll begin with the Department of Planning and our Department of Legislative Services analyst, Andrew Gray, who will walk us through his analysis. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You should be seeing on your screen the operating budget summary for the Maryland Department of Planning, or MDP. The fiscal 23 budget increase is $1.2 million, or around 5%, to $24.3 million. There is a fiscal 22 deficiency. This is federal stimulus funding coming from the American Rescue Plan Act. And the funding would provide for a technician working with the Patterson collections at the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, providing for more access, hopefully, for that information to reflect the agricultural heritage of Southern Maryland. In terms of the overview of agency spending for fiscal 23, you see that a large portion of MDP's funding is in the Management Planning and Educational Outreach Program. That reflects the around $5.6 million or so in grant funding for the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority. Then there are lesser amounts with Operations Division, Museum Services, Planning Coordination, and other programs reflected here. In terms of the fiscal 23 budget, once again, there's around a $1.2 million increase between the 2 years, fiscal 22 and 23. I'll just highlight a couple of the larger items. For the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, there's the $326,000 for moving costs for the Archaeological Conservation Laboratory. There are also costs associated with the, that's for the Patterson Center. And there's also $200,000 for the Archaeological Conservation Laboratory for a walk-in freezer and cooler unit. So there's 2 moving costs for both those entities, and then freezer or cooling costs for the Archaeological Conservation Laboratory. Now we'll move on to 2 other large components of funding in fiscal 23. The Maryland Humanities Council grants. There is a total of $500,000 for a new initiative. This is the SHINE initiative. It would provide for funding for nonprofit organizations, really to help them kind of address the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's funding previously provided in federal funding from the CARES Act, American Rescue Plan Act as well, that they'll kind of build on in terms of their experiences to be able to provide funding for those nonprofit organizations in Maryland to really be able to help them out. In terms of the Humanities Council funding, there's also their original $257,000 appropriation also reflected in fiscal 2022, but instead of the $150,000 in general funds, there's going to be $150,000 in special funds from the lottery funds budgeted in fiscal 23. So they'll have their full $257,000 appropriation, same as the fiscal 22. And then there's a $500,000 increase for the SHINE grants. And then for the Maryland Semi-Quincentennial Commission, there's an increase of $250,000 in general funds. The commission was created by an executive order in January 2021. However, it was not funded at that time. Since then, it had 2 meetings, and they put together a plan for the funding for the $250,000 budget in fiscal 23, including meeting materials, or marketing materials, totaling $135,000. A curriculum report to address the American Revolutionary War period, $15,000 for that purpose, and the professional development company would work on that. Commission travel is $2,500. Conference attendance is $2,500 as well for travel and exhibit setup expenses. There's some funding for print and other collateral funding, around $25,000. And finally, translation services, $20,000, and $50,000 for a scholars colloquium to kind of explore some of those underrepresented stories in the American Revolutionary War period to make sure that everybody's kind of stories are discussed. Department of Legislative Services recommends that community narrative be added, requiring submission of the report by December 22 on how the fiscal 23 funding is being used by the commission. Moving now to personnel data, you see that there's no change in the regular positions between the 2 years. And they've had done a substantial amount of work in terms of reducing their long-term vacancies, which is always appreciated and helps to benefits the agency's mission as well. In terms of the issues, first issue concerns kind of update on the census. This is additional information about the Census 2020 self-response rates. So we're now getting down to kind of like a lower level or kind of more detailed level in terms of what those self-response rates were. You see the counties had an 88% self-response rate. And then it goes down to 58% for the census tracts. And what this appears to reflect is that large counties or counties may have relatively few census tracts and therefore have a fairly high self-response rate for that entire county, but then other counties might have many different census tracts within them, and therefore they would kind of bring down their census tract numbers can be lower for self-response. There's a final step in the process to look at the census count question resolutions operation and the 2020 post-census group quarters review. These are kind of looking at any potential processing errors, and DLS recommends that NDP comment whether it plans to participate in either of those processes and how they might affect the Census Bureau's population estimates program. In terms of the second issue, this concerns the US population growth and Maryland's population. So the US population growth actually shrank, or is only increased by 0.1%, the lowest level since the founding of the nation, between December 21 or July 1, 2020 and July 1, 2021. So in that 1 year period, there was only 0.1% growth, and actually Maryland's population shrank by around 7,600 people, which placed Maryland 40th out of 51 jurisdictions in terms of population growth overall. Moving to the exhibit, you kind of get a big picture here, look at what that means. You look at the far left-hand side of this exhibit, you see that the total population actually increased for Texas, Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia. And this seems to reflect a lot of migration within the country between the Northeast to the Southwest and the kind of the South in general, where it's warmer, where retirees might find more comfortable retirement situations, and also just kind of general movement of population into those particular areas. There's also considerations here about birth rates overall seem to be kind of declining somewhat, and we're seeing less migration though coming in from international position. And then if you look on the right-hand side of the graph here, you see that there's actually population declines in New York, California, Illinois, Massachusetts, and so forth. Maryland is tucked in right here. And so similar issue in terms of the birth rates maybe not being as high, and then also kind of migration concerns as well. DLS recommends that MDP comments on the long-term impacts of the decline in Maryland's population on school enrollment, jobs, and state revenues, and any impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on birth rates in Maryland in particular. The third issue kind of looks at the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority grants. Exhibit 5 here reflects that the total cash and in-kind match leverage is still above the amount funded. So therefore, they're meeting their one-to-one kind of goal of matching funding for the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority grants. In terms of some updates, the economic contribution study was completed last year, and MDP had actually hoped to be able to update that information with nonprofit organizations and certified heritage areas around the state in the upcoming years. That plan, that process will have to be pushed out to fiscal 24 or 25, even due to concerns that the nonprofit organizations are experiencing challenges during the pandemic and therefore not able to add this additional reporting requirement to their complement of activities. In terms of racial equity, Maryland, Department of Planning, Maryland Historical Trust are looking at expanding, kind of looking at that racial equity concerns for the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority grants. They've instituted a work group to look at that, and they're hoping to have a report later summer, later at the end of fiscal calendar 22, addressing this question. Recommended action here is for the Maryland Semi-Quincentennial Commission funding report. And then in terms of updates, historic revitalization tax credit program staffing report was submitted, and the position, that contractual FTE, was converted to a full-time position. So now they have 3 regular positions in that office, and that's improved their measures in terms of being able to reduce the turnaround periods for looking at the tax credits, the residential, and then the small commercial and the large commercial as well. And then in terms of the one Appendix 2 audit finding question, there are no audit findings to disclose. The NDP did have a clean audit. Unless there are any questions, that concludes the presentation.
Andrew, thank you. Are there any questions for the analyst? Okay, we'll now turn to the department. I know we have Planning Secretary McCord. I think he's joined by Elizabeth Hughes from the Maryland Historical Trust. And I don't know if he's joined by or just also here, but we also have Lindsay Baker from Maryland Humanities Council as well. So Secretary McCord, let me turn it over to you. Thanks for being with us.
Unmute, Rob. Thank you very much. After all these Zoom calls, we still do that. Sorry about that. Thank you. Mr. Chair, and members of the commission, your committee. I want to begin by thanking Andrew Gray with his insightful analysis and his attention to detail. He spends a lot of time trying to understand what we do, all the different things we do in planning. So I really appreciate his efforts. So appreciate that. I'm joined here with Elizabeth Hughes from the Maryland Historical Trust, and also Jeff Can, my Assistant Secretary of Operations. So Jeff is here with me today. So I'll just hit the things that Andrew had pointed out to you. The census count question resolution process is something that we've been involved in and we're making sure that all the local jurisdictions are also involved in this process. MDP has already presented to the Planning Directors Roundtable, the State Data Center Affiliates meetings, the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, the Maryland WashCog cooperative there, the Baltimore, the DC suburbs jurisdictions. They know all about the program, how the program works, and that we will supply support in order to support their efforts to challenge any numbers that they want to challenge. I want to make this point that this is not really about the challenging the number of people. This process with the census in the census count question resolution process is really focused on addresses. So it is about whether or not the addresses have been actually covered by the census. That happens sometimes when you have a jurisdiction that has annexation go on and the annexation hasn't been updated so that no one in the Census Bureau realized that this is part of a town or this is part of a city. This thought to be part of the county. So these addresses were either included or excluded or totally missed from either the county or the city. So the best example I give is if there are only 6 houses on 1029 Oak Avenue and only 2 of them were counted, then there's 4 houses that were not counted. But if Oak Avenue in those past 10 years extended across Maple Avenue and continued on and they built new houses and all of those 10 more houses were not counted, then you would pick up the 38 people that live in those 10 houses because those 10 addresses were missed. So it's an address focused process. We have a local update of census addresses program in the Department of Planning that is envy of some people in the US Census Bureau. They want to work with us to prepare the rest of the country for how well we do in updating those census addresses. During the process of the pandemic, I personally wrote a letter to every college president in Maryland, reminding them of their obligations to report the numbers for their students. The numbers of the students that are housed on campus would be the group quarters count, which is very important. And also the information they have about students that live other than on campus, but in that area. So College Park, for instance, would get credit for the students that live in College Park because the emergency services and the other services that are available to the citizens of College Park would include all of the students who live in the College Park area. So that LUCA process is a continual process. We make sure that every time an annexation review happens at the Department of Planning, census update information is provided with our review. That's one of the ways we make sure we try to keep it current. The other thing is that I took a look at 10 years ago, the challenges made under this program. There were about 14 jurisdictions in Baltimore City that made challenges to the program on the question count resolution program. And there were 2,124 people identified as a positive and 1,792 people identified negatively as far as they were already counted for or had been double counted. It netted only 332 people. I say that just to let you know that for all the challenges of the 2020 census, and there clearly were many, is making sure that the addresses were correct is still key to making sure that count is good. We stand ready to help anybody at any level of jurisdiction from city, town, or county who wants to challenge the numbers, and we will supply that information. We will work together with them. We don't have any grave concerns that large swaths of our state were missed in this process. And then the second thing that DLS has recommended to comment on is the long-term impacts of the decline in Maryland's population. And my first caution is that it's premature to speculate on what all the factors are that go into that, because we're just emerging from a pandemic. As we saw later in the analysis, that we had this problem back during the Spanish flu. So we have this issue, we're keeping an eye on it. We are responsible for school enrollment projections, so we take that very seriously. Every county must send their school enrollment projections to us. And if they vary by more than 5%, we have to have a conversation with the county about their methodology. That's under COMAR right now. There is lots of information coming out about the pandemic that, of course, it wasn't like a snowstorm where people sat in their houses together and then we had a lot of babies born after that. It is exactly the opposite from most demographers' research that we're seeing. That is a baby bust. There are people concerned about their jobs, people concerned about social safety net, people concerned about whether or not to have the next child or have the first child. And that when you combine that with the later ages that people are having children within this country, that's causing a dip in the population. And we want to see if that dip is just a temporary thing and it's going to rebound, or if it's something that we have to plan for the long term. Right now, we can't really figure that out. We are looking at those numbers. When the American Community Survey numbers come out again, we'll be able to see a lot more of the why as far as what happened. But right now, we're paying attention and we're making sure that we're working closely with each of the school jurisdictions as they give us their numbers to make sure that our numbers are not off too far. There's more detail in the written stuff that I provided to you. The written comments also mentioned that to the extent that a good economy has a positive impact on population growth, there are other indicators published by the Census Bureau that show that our economy is in good shape. Maryland is fourth in the nation in business applications, up 2.6%. Virginia actually showing negative numbers. And even more telling is the business applications with wages in Maryland, second in the nation. And finally, Maryland is first in the nation in general sales tax collections, up 46.40%. So there are other indications that our economy is doing way better, and that bodes well for the population. The population will actually, that dip that Andrew identified will not get deeper. It will actually be just a dip and it will come back up again. So right now, that's my recommendation to you, is that it's a little bit premature to ask exactly what the response would be for a negative population number right now. And then the last comment, the simple comment on the America 250 Commission, which I was on the commission call today, so this is our third call today. The commission is fleshed out, has its subcommittee set up, and is preparing to break into the subcommittees to do the work of committee to bring back to the full commission. I just give you some neighboring state comparisons of funding that have happened. Pennsylvania had a first request in 2019 of about $200,000. They now have requested $500,000 in state funds for FY23. New Jersey, they got started in 2018, and they had an appropriation of $500,000, and they spent $300,000 of that on tourist site readiness assessments. Massachusetts has spent, they have a request of $1.25 million over the next 2 years. Virginia has provided $245,000 in seed money, and they're submitting a $15 million budget request over 4 years. And South Carolina started with a $245,000 request. Now they've submitted a $9.9 million request for the next year. And they made a request last year for $1.5 million focusing on education. So we are not the first state in this process. We're not the last state in the process. And this is going to be a commemoration of everything that we are as a country, kind of like a birthday, not just a commemoration of what happened on July 4th, 1776. It is clearly not intended to be something where we just paint the fire hydrants and go home. We are going to make sure that underrepresented stories are told, and that the promises of liberty that continue to unfold that story as part of what this American story is. So we're going to make sure that we focus on that. And with that, I'll stand for any kind of questions that the chair or the committee might have.
Thank you. Any questions for the department before we give the Maryland Historical Trust and Maryland Humanities an opportunity? I do not see any questions, Mr.
Okay.
Secretary, so let me turn it to Elizabeth Hughes from the Maryland Historical Trust.
Well, thank you. I really don't have anything to add, as we're part of the Maryland Department of Planning. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'll defer my time to Lindsay Baker with the Maryland Humanities Council, who's testifying as a member of the public.
Great. I'll hand it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I'm Lindsay Baker, Executive Director of Maryland Humanities. I thank you for your past support and for hearing me today. I ask that you approve the proposed funds included for our work by Governor Hogan in the 2023 budget via the Maryland Historical Trust and the Maryland Department of Planning. Both $257,000 in operating funds and $500,000 for the new Shine or Strengthening Humanities Investment in Nonprofits for Equity grant-making initiative, which we will launch later this year and which Andrew mentioned earlier. Despite the ongoing impacts of the pandemic, Maryland Humanities public humanities programs reached more than 200,000 people with more than 1,100 events, both in-person and virtual, including exhibit tours, discussions, workshops, and screenings. This included direct service to nearly 25,000 students and hundreds of teachers from all 23 counties and Baltimore City. Among our most impactful programs is Maryland History Day, which saw more than 19,000 middle and high schoolers become both college and career ready. And this number is kind of hard for me to think about. They collectively generated an immense body of hours dedicated to research and learning, the equivalent of more than 28 years worth of study in 2021 alone. So we're not playing around with our History Day students. They're doing real research. 5 times in recent years, Maryland has had National History Day gold medal winners. Also last year, we continued programs for veterans, including 5 virtual book groups in Baltimore, Hartford, Howard, Prince George's, and St. Mary's counties. Through our statewide reading and discussion program, One Maryland, One Book, we distributed more than 9,000 free copies of the Book of Delights by Ross Gay to public high schools, universities, and library systems statewide. Finally, we awarded 25 project-based grants to educational and community organizations across 17 legislative districts, totaling almost $175,000, and 91 general operating COVID relief grants as a part of ARP, totaling $910,000 across 23 of the 47 districts. And I invite you to review our written testimony. I hope that you agree that Maryland Humanities is an exemplary steward of the state's investment, which we leveraged nearly 4 times over in 2021. And given our nearly 50 years of grant-making experience, that you will approve funding of our work, including the new Shine grant-making initiative in the governor's budget. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any further questions from the subcommittee? Okay, well, thank you to the Department of Planning and affiliated or unaffiliated entities. We appreciate you being with us. Colleagues, we will now turn to the analysis of the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
And Mr. Secretary McCord. Our analyst for the PSC is Samuel Quist, so I will hand it over to him.
Thank you and good afternoon. I will share the analysis document, which you should be seeing on your screen now for the Public Service Commission. The fiscal 23 budget for the Public Service Commission totals $22.5 million. This is an increase of approximately 3% or $649,000 from the 2022 working appropriation. You can also see on this chart the representation of the American Rescue Plan Act funding that was allocated in fiscal 21. This was funding for arrearage assistance that was part of the Relief Act of 2021 last legislative session. Before we get into the fiscal 23 budget discussion, I'd like to highlight a couple of items from fiscal 2022. The first is that through October of 2021, the Public Service Commission has assessed and allocated a total of $775,000 in civil fine penalties from several electric and gas suppliers. There's also an additional $150,000 penalty that was issued in January, but has not yet been collected. These fines are deposited or will be deposited into the Retail Choice Customer Education and Protection Special Fund. The fiscal 23 allowance includes an appropriation of $400,000 from the special fund. The other item that the analysis highlights is the recently passed Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This bill contained a wide variety of provisions in the energy sector, including there are two main programs highlighted here that are related to investing in the electric grid, focusing on sustainability and reliability of that Maryland and other states are eligible for, preventing outages and enhancing the resilience of the electric grid, and upgrading our electric grid and ensuring reliability and resiliency. There are also several other provisions, including investments in electric vehicle infrastructure, supply chains for clean energy, as well as efforts to incorporate clean energy sources into the existing electric grid. However, the current dollar amounts and specific details on allocation of those funds into the Maryland state budgets, including allocation to individual state agencies, is not currently known. It's estimated that the federal government and federal agencies will not have full information on that until later in calendar 2022. However, the analysis is assuming that due to the regulatory role of the Public Service Commission over electric utilities in the state, it would have at least some role in the oversight over the distribution of those funds. Turning now to the fiscal 23 overview, exhibit number 1 shows that approximately 77% of the proposed budget is covering personnel expenses. There's also an additional 9% which covers outside experts and consultants. These are outside individuals who provide technical expertise to the commission for hearings and other cases. There's also a 2% of the budget covering the annual grant to the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Commission. Moving to the changes in the budget this year, again, the main increase, the largest increase is $400,000 from the Retail Choice Customer Education and Protection Special Fund. These dollars are providing contractual services for customer outreach and materials related to electric choice. There's also an increase for personnel expenses, with the main component being increases to employee and retiree health insurance premium costs. The personnel data overview of the analysis shows the number of regular and contractual positions is remaining unchanged in fiscal 23. There are a total of 138 regular positions and 15 contractual positions. And at the end of fiscal 2021, or calendar 2021 rather, there were a total of 14 vacant positions. And the analysis is asking the commission to comment on efforts that it is taking to fill vacant positions. Turning to the key observations section of the analysis, the first area of discussion is related to the distribution of the $83 million in utility arrearage assistance funding. Exhibit 3 on the screen shows the distribution of how those funds were allocated by PSC to the utilities in Maryland. As you can see, the largest share, about 60% of total funding, went to Baltimore Gas and Electric, and the next largest distributions were to the major investor-owned utilities. It's worth noting when looking at this chart that Baltimore Gas and Electric serves both gas and electric customers, while the other major investor-owned utilities do not, so that has some impact on the size of share of distribution to BG&E. Related to the Relief Act of 2021, as you remember, this was passed by the General Assembly and signed into law by the governor in February last year. The provisions related to arrearage assistance identified three main categories which would be targeted by the funds. The first was arrearages held by customers who had received energy assistance or qualified for energy assistance from the Department of Human Services Office of Home Energy Programs within the previous 4 years. The second category was arrearages held by special needs customers. And the third category was focusing on the oldest of the outstanding arrearages. And the Public Service Commission found that there was sufficient funding to retire all of the arrearages in the first two categories. However, the size of arrearages outstanding in the third category was sizable enough that there was only partial funding for this. And the Public Service Commission also found that there was not uniform data across all utilities regarding age of arrearages. So rather than that, they determined through their ruling on the distribution of these funds that they would be distributed as an equal share to each utility based on the proportion of outstanding arrearages, and it would be up to the utilities themselves, pending the availability of age data, to distribute funds based on oldest arrearages first. The Public Service Commission indicated that the 83 million was distributed during the summer of 2021. Turning to the next section, in the key observations section, we have a few charts on arrearage data reported by the Public Service Commission on its website. Exhibit number 4 is the count of customers with outstanding arrearages by utility for the 5 main investor-owned utilities. And as you can see, there's a little bit of variation in this chart, including increases during calendar 2020 related to the pandemic. And in 2021, there are generally a smaller number of customers with outstanding arrearages. However, compared to Exhibit 5, there's more variation in Exhibit 5, which shows the total dollar amount of outstanding arrearages. And as you can see, there was a substantial increase in calendar 2020 related to impacts of the pandemic, while the utility termination moratorium was in effect between March and November of 2020. There's a pretty steady increase each month during that time period. And between the period of March 2020 and December 2020, there was about $103 million increase, and the peak total in December 2020 totaled $212 million. So this is about a 98% increase, almost double during that time period. And that dollar amount remained elevated over the next 6 out of 9 months, over $200 million, until you can see in June and July, corresponding to the distribution of the 83 million, there was about a 30% decrease from June to July of 2021. And the level for the remainder of 2021 through November, the most recent month that data is available, there's been a continued decreased level compared to calendar 2020, although compared to pre-pandemic, the dollar amount is still elevated. If you compare the 2021 total in November to the 2019 total in November, it's about 50% higher still. And the analysis is asking PSC to comment if they have any other insight or information on efforts taken to continue to address outstanding arrearages and assistance provided to customers, specifically in the low income category, despite all of the federal stimulus funds that have been allocated, the total still remaining elevated above pre-pandemic levels. And then Exhibit 6 is the average dollar amount of arrearages per customer with outstanding arrearages. Due to the fact that the total dollar amount increased at a larger rate than the total number of customers, the average also shows a similar trend, increasing through calendar 2020 and reaching a peak in early calendar 2021. The total for the 5 utilities represented was about $607 per customer. This ranged from a low of $417 for the Potomac Edison Company to a high of $750 for Baltimore Gas and Electric. And again, you can see a decrease in the summer of 2021 corresponding to that distribution of the 83 million. And similar to the previous chart, although there was that decrease, the totals through the remainder of calendar 2021 are still elevated over the pre-pandemic levels at the end of 2019. The next section of the analysis deals with complaint data received by the Public Service Commission. Exhibit 7 is a summary for calendar years 2018 through 2020 on complaints received by utility supplier and other regulated entity. And you can see there is a pretty sizable decrease in 2020 corresponding to the time period that the utility termination moratorium was in effect. And this trend is comparable to trends in other agencies, such as in the Office of People's Counsel, there was a decrease in calls for assistance. And in the Department of Human Services Office of Home Energy Programs, there was a decrease in applications for energy assistance during this time period. The data shown in Exhibit 7 was part of a joint chairman's report submitted to the General Assembly as a result of interest that was raised by the budget committees during last year's session on tracking complaints against utilities in the state. The Public Service Commission currently publishes complaint data only for electric third-party suppliers on its website, and it was asked during last session whether there could be complaint data for both utilities and suppliers. The report submitted by PSC indicated that they are currently in the process of implementing a new IT system related to tracking of complaints, and that once it is available, there will be additional data for both entities published on its website with enhanced reporting capabilities. But in the meantime, they provided this data that they've tracked internally, which leads to the recommended actions section. The Department of Legislative Services is recommending one recommendation, the adoption of committee narrative, which is requesting information on the process of implementing this new complaint reporting system. And if for some reason it is not available to report complaints on their website at the time of the report, we're asking that the report contains similar data as was contained in the previous report, updated for calendar 2021, and if available, 2022 data. Lastly, in the update section, the analysis contains a brief update on some notable developments. The first is in the offshore wind area. There was the approval of the second round of offshore renewable energy credits by the Public Service Commission. This section of the analysis also notes information on the electric vehicle charging pilot program for the utilities. But for the sake of time, I'm going to leave the presentation at that, and I can take any questions at this time.
Thank you very much. Any questions for the analyst? Okay, I do not see any. So with that, we can turn it over to the Public Service Commission and their chair, Jason Stanek. And let me just say, we obviously appreciate the work of you and your fellow commissioners and all of your staff, but I got to shout out Lisa Smith, who handles our constituent complaints, and appreciate her being on and all her help. And with that, Chairman Stanek, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate that recognition. And good afternoon, other members of the subcommittee. First, let me thank DLS analyst Mr. Quist. His report was accurate and very detailed in his recitation. As you may know, we are a small but powerful independent agency. We are special funded entirely, and we serve as the state's utility regulator. The agency takes pride in its stewardship of its funds, and this year the recommendation is $22.5 million. The state's primary activities right now with respect to the PSC involved moving forward our portfolio to advance a clean energy future for Maryland. You saw that in Mr. Quist's recitation of the offshore wind OREX that we just recently approved in December for an additional 1,700 megawatts. We have a 5-year energy storage pilot that is constructing battery storage all the way from the Panhandle to the Eastern Shore. And we're also in the process of building out approximately 1,000 utility-owned electric vehicle infrastructure. That's basically chargers. So slow chargers, fast chargers, all along the transportation corridors. And I'd be happy to discuss any of those programs in more detail. With respect to a few of the highlights that Mr. Quist just brought to the committee's attention, I'd like to touch on vacancies first. He was correct that at the close of this past year, we had 14 vacancies open. I'm happy to report that we've cut that number nearly in half. As of today, we're down to 8 vacancies. And of the 4 vacancies that were open for 1 year or more, we've cut that number from 4 to 2. And the remaining 2 vacancies are currently in the interview process. And we hope to be making an offer to those candidates in the very near future. With respect to third-party retail suppliers, we did collect over $775,000 with more penalty revenue inbound very soon, and we have plans to put that money to good use. Most of that money that you see in this budget for FY23, over $400,000, would be used to and would be earmarked for customer education. So that would involve the commission proactively taking a look at what areas of the state are seeing activity, which would either, 1, lead us to believe that there are more complaints in particular neighborhoods, or 2, we have some trends and analysis from our Consumer Affairs Division that would tell us that we need to focus on more direct marketing materials, more advertising, and better outreach to communicate the fact that the commission has a number of websites designed to help electric utility and natural gas customers shop for their power provider. So you can purchase the commodity, either electric or gas, through a competitive third-party supplier. And that website is mdenergychoice.com. We've also launched in the past year about a half dozen prosecutions and investigations into retail suppliers who have engaged in potentially deceptive marketing practices. And since the policy of the state has been for the past 20 years to encourage competition in retail supply, that's an important function that this commission plays. Finally, with respect to the database that we have mentioned by Mr. Quist, we are in the midst of a transition. We're almost actually complete with the transition from a legacy database to a new cloud-based database that we're working with a third-party IT contractor. Hopefully that database will be in place by the end of this month. If not, it'll be in place by the end of the first quarter of this year at the very latest. That database will allow us to review and analyze data much more easily than the manual processes that we employ today to figure out where we see trends or problems with either utility complaint statistics or with supplier complaint statistics. So I'll be very happy to announce and comply with the recommended Joint Chairman's report as recommended by Mr. Quist And we'll have that data for the committee's review by the end of this year. But let me just state on behalf of the commission's 138 full-time employees that we are committed to the mission of ensuring that our public service companies are adequately regulated. At the same time, moving forward, this state's position as a leader on clean energy issues. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Chair Stanek. I do have one question. I don't know if you have the analysis that was provided, but at the bottom of page 2, it talks about some of those federal dollars, including potential federal dollars related to the grid. I was just reading about the grid in Maryland Matters this morning and over the weekend. So I was wondering if you had any insight yet into how we might use those funds, recognizing that, the amount of money is not known yet, at least on the formula funds. We'll get something. Obviously, the discretionary funds, we don't know yet.
Correct. President Biden signed that bill into law back in November. The funds haven't been allocated yet, but at least public service commissions around the country are allocated up to $5 billion in funds for grid modernization. Some of that will be formulaic and some of that will be grant or application based. And this commission will, as our track record has shown, when federal funds are available, we go after those funds. So we're looking forward to seeing the details and working with our National Trade Organization, NARUC, in order to figure out how we can access the IIJA fund, because there's a lot of money on the table, and the last thing we want to do is leave money on the table.
Any other questions for the agency from my colleagues? Okay, I do usually like to note that every once in a while I have to put a filing into the Public Service Commission for my day job. You can read all that and more in my ethics file. It's really exciting stuff. Thank you to the Public Service Commission for being with us. Colleagues, we will now turn to our final agency of the day, the Office of People's Counsel, and back to Mr. Quist for the analysis.
Thank you. I will share my screen again and turn to the analysis. For the Office of People's Counsel, you should see on the screen in front of you now, the fiscal 23 allowance is a total of $5.3 million. This is an increase of 2.7%, or approximately $142,000. The Office of People's Counsel, similar to the Public Service Commission, is entirely special funded. The Office of People's Counsel is entirely specially funded. The Public Service Commission is majority specially funded through a utility assessment on utility operations. And in fiscal 2023, there is some impact on that assessment due to the bill Chapter 607 of 2021, which is enacted last legislative session. Primarily, this bill included a change in statute to increase the OPC's statutory cap on public service companies' operating revenues from 0.05% to 0.074%, which is about a 50% increase. This provides the Office of People's Counsel with a little bit of additional leeway in the maximum amount of funding available to them. Prior to the increase in the statutory cap, the allowance total had started to reach close to that maximum. However, with the new increase, the fiscal 23 allowance of $5.3 million represents about 60% of the new statutory maximum. So there's a little bit more leeway there for future funding increases in future fiscal years. The other component of Chapter 607 was the increase in the statutory responsibilities of the office to include considerations of climate change and other environmental impacts. As a result of this increase in responsibilities, there was a budget amendment processed in fiscal 22, which increased the fiscal 22 working appropriation by about $920,000. This included funds to support an additional 3 contractual staff attorney positions and funds for other operating expenses, including outside legal services support. Moving to the overview of the fiscal 23 spending in Exhibit 1. As you can see, a little over half of the budget covers the personnel expenses for the office. The other main component is for outside experts and consultants, which provide legal and other technical assistance similar to the Public Service Commission for regulatory proceedings through the Public Service Commission and other regulatory bodies, including federal bodies. The Exhibit 2, which shows the proposed budget changes, the largest increase is again to contractual personnel expenses related to those 3 additional contractual staff attorney positions. There's also about a $58,000 net increase to personnel expenses, with the largest component being an $80,000 increase due to the reclassification for attorney and other position salaries. Turning to the personnel data, there are 19 total positions and 3 contractual positions. This number remains unchanged in the FY23 allowance, and the 3 contractual positions represent the positions previously mentioned that were increased by budget amendment related to Chapter 607. The vacancy rate at the end of calendar 2021 stood at 2 vacant positions. In the key observations section, exhibit number 3 shows data on the number of cases participated in, both in front of the Public Service Commission as well as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and other appellate court cases. The total number declined by about 14% in fiscal 2021. The number of favorable decisions shown also declined from about 94 to 73. However, if you look at the total share of cases participated in, the total share of federal cases increased slightly due to an increased share of cases before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Exhibit number 4 includes data reported on the number of calls to the office for assistance or information. As you can see, in 2020, the number was impacted by the pandemic, similar to the complaint data with the Public Service Commission. There was a decrease during the time period that the utility termination moratorium was in effect. However, in calendar 2021, the number increased slightly. However, it is still at a lower level than in 2019 and previous years. Finally, the Department of Legislative Services is recommending concurring with the governor's allowance. And that concludes the presentation for the Office of People's Counsel.
Thank you. Any questions for the analyst? Okay, I do not see any. So with that, let's turn it over to the People's Counsel himself, David Lapp. Mr. Lapp, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chair Corman, members of the subcommittee. David Lapp, People's Counsel. I'm here with Deputy Counsel Bill Fields. We appreciate all your time today and the Department of Legislative Services analysis, Mr. Quist's work, and we agree with DLS's recommendation. To start, I wanted to thank the staff of the Office of People's Counsel for all their work. I've been on the job 1 year and I've been very impressed with all the OPC staff. It's a talented and dedicated staff, and it's been a real pleasure to work with everyone. I've been working hard with the staff to maximize the use of every dollar that the agency receives. As you know, our primary statutory responsibility is to represent the interests of residential utility customers in regulatory proceedings. That responsibility is critical during this time of rapid change in our regulated industries. Last year, the legislature added new responsibilities to our mandate to consider the environment and the state's climate goals in our work. Those changes were consistent with changes to the PSC statute. The number of state and federal proceedings in which we are engaged is growing over time, and those cases are becoming more and more complex. The budget amendment we received for this fiscal year helps support all of our work, as well as some of my efforts reorganizing the office, including the hiring of 3 contract lawyers that Mr. Quist mentioned. We're involved in virtually every proceeding before the PSC and many other proceedings before federal agencies, especially the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Some of those cases we initiate. In other cases, the utilities or other entities bring to the commission and we then become parties. Our cases involve water, gas, and electric utilities, retail suppliers, and we are involved in a variety of generic proceedings. As mentioned, the cases are becoming increasingly complex. We now have multi-year utility rate cases, and we have federal proceedings, including FERC proceedings that are considering major changes to the transmission system. We expect the complexity to continue as we incorporate the expanded scope to our mission and as state policies on climate change drive changes to utility regulation. These are very interesting times, especially in the world of energy policy, and we look forward to representing residential customers in the continuing discussion. We appreciate the subcommittee's review of our budget and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for the Office of People's Counsel? Okay, I do not see any questions, so thank you for being here. Colleagues, that was our last agency for the day. Just a public service announcement. We're actually on the House floor at 10 a.m. tomorrow. If you're like me and not ready for that, you need the reminder. And then full committees back to virtual at 1 p.m. But I think with that, that's it for the subcommittee today. And we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.